Welcome to our second session of this morning, the third day of CHOW. Before we begin the session, I want to encourage you to fill out the question cards if you have any questions for the panel, and volunteers will be walking around collecting them. And again, for our online audience, you can submit your questions to the panel via Twitter using the hashtag CHOW2016. Our presenting sponsor, the Walton Family Foundation, has made a long-term commitment to the restoration of the Gulf region to ensure that its economy, environment, and communities can thrive now and for generations to come. As we tee up this conversation on the vision of the Gulf restoration, we are proud to showcase the quick word from our presenting sponsor. Thank you. On April 4th of this year, a federal judge signed the consent decree approving the historic $20.8 billion settlement for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the largest marine oil spill in U.S. history. Today's session brings together the major decision makers and local players to connect the dots, better coordinate, streamline the processes, and find ways to leverage resources in order to make a greater impact for the entire Gulf region. Andy Snyder has covered the progress and action since the Deepwater Horizon oil spill with Greenwire, Environment and Energy Daily, E&E, and now with Politico Pro, where she covers water issues including battles over the scope of the Clean Water Act, drought, water pollution, and the efforts to restore large ecosystems. I pass the baton on to Annie. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is really a timely moment to be having this conversation. As was said, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill was not only a massive disaster in an ecosystem that was already ailing in so many ways, but it also created an opportunity, thanks probably to a number of people in the room. There was a massive effort to turn all that public attention into resources for restoring the Gulf. And that effort has paid off, most recently with this $20 billion settlement, $13 billion of which is tagged for restoration and recovery in the Gulf of Mexico. It's an enormous opportunity, but it is not going to be simple. There are multiple funding streams, each with their own sort of requirements and target. There are a number of different players at the state and federal level some of whom have, their own interests, some not always perfectly aligned. And then there's the technical challenges. This is an enormous ecosystem, and some of what's being considered for restoration simply hasn't been tried before, certainly at the scale. So we're fortunate to have, as I said, some of the key players in all of this here to talk with us about it. Before we get started, I just wanted to give sort of a quick primer on the kind of three main funding streams that we're going to be talking about. The first, sort of chronologically, was money from the criminal settlement between BP and Transocean and the federal government. So that criminal settlement had sort of a surprise provision in there that tagged $2.5 billion for restoration in the Gulf. And that money is being managed by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. NIFWF is much easier to say. Then there's sort of the more traditional restoration mechanism. That's the Natural Resources Damages Assessment. And that's sort of old school restoration when there's an oil spill. The idea being that when there's a spill, the responsible party should pay to restore the ecosystem to the state that it was in the day before the spill. So if you oil 1 acre of wetlands, you need to restore, an acre of wetlands. And then the third mechanism is related to the Restore Act. So there was a feeling in the wake of this massive spill that it wasn't good enough just to restore the ecosystem to the state it had been in before the spill, but that more needed to be done. So the big money in spills can be the Clean Water Act penalties, but traditionally that money goes into a trust fund. And so there was an effort by advocates to take that money and instead of sending it into a trust fund, send it back to the Gulf. And so the Restore Act, which was passed by Congress in 2012, sends 80% of the Clean Water Act civil penalties to the 5 Gulf states, and that's sort of managed by the Restore Council, which is a federal and state entity. So that's sort of your vegetables. That's what we're going to be talking about. So handing it over to our panelists, let me introduce you. We've got Robert Bonney. He's the Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment at USDA. And USDA recently took over the chair of the Restore Council. We've got Leslie Craig. She is Southeast Regional Supervisor for NOAA's Restoration Center and has been involved with NERDA from day one. We've got Roberta Swan. She is the Director of the Mobile Bay National Estuaries Program. That's hard to say. And is sort of our boots on the ground perspective. And then we've got Mike Sharp. He is a Director of the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund at NIFWF. So Robert, I hope you can start us off. Like I said, USDA recently took over the chair of the Restore Council. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of your vision for what the next few months of the Obama administration are going to look like? And maybe just tell us a little bit about how this council works. It's sort of a unique entity with both federal and state players at the table.
Right, so you've got 6 federal agencies at the table and then 5 states. We have, as you pointed out, a significant pot of resources to distribute. About a third of that goes just automatically to states. A third of it is based on the spill impacts to each state, and then a third is in a fund that is a kind of a restoration fund, and we will make decisions over a the next 15-year time frame about how to spend that last pot that I talked about. We affectionately call it Bucket 2. And that has to be done in concert with the states and the federal government working together. I've done conservation for a long time, and I haven't been in many places where this is the way conservation is being done. But I think obviously there's a real opportunity here to see if this model can actually work. We've already made investments of north of $160 million through our funded priorities list that was released last year. I think as we look forward this year, we want to take stock of what we did. I think we've got a good bunch of projects. We've done really good work, but I think there are also a lot of lessons to learn. And so I think the next several months is about taking stock of what we did, what we can improve, and look towards a rewrite of the comprehensive plan to take some of those lessons and put them into a comprehensive plan that hopefully will take those lessons and push them forward as the council looks forward to spending dollars in the future.
Now, part of the difference here when you're kind of taking stock looking back is that when those initial grants were made, you didn't know how much money you were going to have. Right. Now we know. That's sort of a similar challenge that NIFWF has been dealing with, Mike. NIFWF's $2.5 billion through the criminal settlement came several years before we knew what the Restore money and the NERDA money was going to be. How did NIFWF think about the role that it was going to play during that interim period? And now that we know how much is ultimately going to be available, what's the role for the NIFWF dollars going forward?
So I think part of our challenge early on was we have consultation requirements with state resource agencies and with 2 federal agencies, NOAA and Fish and Wildlife. And part of the early conversations were what should we be doing now early, knowing that there was additional funding coming behind, and how could we help facilitate a better understanding of maybe how those resources could be used. And what we ended up thinking about and what we ended up working on with several states is really engaging in planning and building some planning capacity so that everybody had a better picture of potentially how these resources could be used to ultimately benefit the environment down there. So that's kind of how we did it early on. At the same time, each of the states, I think, had very a fairly good-sized list of things that they wanted to try to accomplish as well. So we were trying to meet some immediate needs, but also beginning to think about longer-term planning and how that would inform our decision-making, but also how it might benefit Restore and NRD as well.
Now, Leslie, you've been involved with the NERDA process really since day one, right? I think this is one of the more kind of fascinating aspects of the whole spill, what was going on behind the scenes. Can you tell us a little bit about what that process looked like in the early days, and then as you were kind of thinking forward towards restoration, I mean, how do you even approach the idea of restoring an ecosystem that was already ailing, so much and then, was reeling from this massive spill?
Sure. So just for those that aren't maybe as familiar with the NRDA process, certainly when an incident occurs, there's response activities that the Coast Guard is organizing really to try and contain the incident and to decrease any future impacts of that incident. And so the NRDA starts hand in hand with that to start to look at potential pathways, potential ways that oil could be impacting the resources that we're charged, that are in our trust responsibility. So potential pathways to injury is basically what we're looking at. And once we start to follow those lines of evidence and to ask questions about, in this particular incident, the oil was released, a massive amount of oil from depth, and we've never really dealt with that challenge before in that particular way at that scale. There was also dispersants used, which caused that oil to move in ways that were different at a scale, again, than we had dealt with before. And so the entire front end of that injury assessment was really trying to determine, based on the way that the oil is moving, what are the likely pathways and potential exposure that could have occurred. Then we determine if there was an injury to those resources. Once we start to get some insight into what those potential injuries could be, we immediately start to think about restoration, because we want to be collecting information in the injury assessment that will help us plan for effective restoration. And so if you're collecting metrics that really don't get to an end point of, well, what could we possibly do about this? Even if we knew an answer of there was something that happened, if we don't know what we could do with that information, then it's not as useful to us. So restoration is always in the forefront of our mind throughout that NRDA process. Fast forwarding, certainly, I think pretty much as we started to look at all those potential pathways and exposure, almost everywhere we looked, we saw some kind of injury. And a lot of our NRDA work in other cases, you follow, your lines of injury, and you plan kind of specific restoration for those resources, and you call it good. You balance the books on what was injured versus what was restored. And at this scale, we certainly recognize we weren't able to measure every potential injury that possibly occurred. But when you start to connect the dots, it starts to tell a story of an ecosystem injury. And that's how we approach restoration. And the restoration plan that we've put together for the NRDA component, we refer to it as an integrated ecosystem restoration plan, where we're restoring habitats at large scale. That's really the basis of the investment in the Gulf. Recognizing that there are also very specific resources, like marine mammals, sea turtles, oysters, that need some real focus and care to ensure that they aren't kind of lost in the mix of only focusing on habitats. So it's a balanced approach, I think, to restoration that we've put forward, and now the trick will be making that happen with projects.
It's really fascinating. So, Roberta, what does this end up looking like on the ground to you as somebody who's focused on a specific ecosystem? You've got all of these different sort of avenues to funding. How do you look at that? And maybe also just give us a little bit of a introduction to Mobile Bay, what the unique challenges and issues there are, and what the kind of connection to the broader Gulf is.
Well, I think Mobile Bay and really the coast of Alabama is a microcosm of what's happening along all of the United States coasts. We're challenged by development. People want to be at the beach, or they want to be, along the water. So in Alabama, we were lucky to have the National Estuary Program in place. It was created through amendments to the Clean Water Act, and EPA established our program in 1995. So since 1995, the coast of Alabama has been working on bringing different stakeholders to the table and cobbling together, frankly, different resources to try to improve the way we manage our land and water. So ironically, the BP oil spill, in a lot of senses, was a silver lining for us, because for so many years we had this comprehensive conservation and management plan in place, and yet we had no funding source to implement many of the actions. And you can't engage stakeholders on the ground if you don't have results from projects. What the oil spill gave us was money. I mean, it's a weird feeling to in one sense, be devastated by the spill, but then in the other sense, be excited about the possibilities of having actual funding in place to implement some of the many plans that we knew we had to do in order to change the way we behaved with our resources. So for Mobile, we were lucky, particularly because we already had a specific watershed plan in place. So when NIFWIF came to the table with funding, we were able to say, we have projects that have been identified through a science-based process, through a community-driven process. So yes, we're ready to go, we've got projects. But then, beyond that, you have permitting, you have contracting. There's a lot of different pieces that go into restoration so that you can't automatically put money on the ground. So it's very complicated in terms of, number one, knowing which funding source is the most appropriate for your particular project, but more so, what we're focused on in Alabama is we don't want our funding to go just to indiscriminate projects. We want to look at things holistically, and we also want to fund projects within a context of how are we changing our regulatory system, our local regulation, so that when we invest all this money in restoration, we know that there is a safety net in place to protect those restoration dollars long term, and we know that we have communities in place that understand the importance of the restoration, why it happened in the first place, what the stressors were, how we're addressing those stresses in context of doing the restorations.
So there's a very large amount of money available. There's also a huge need. What does success from all of this look like? What's the end goal here? And I guess I put that to everybody. I'm kind of curious from each of you.
Well, I'll start just from the restore side. Obviously, habitat, water quality, marine and coastal resources, those are all important things. But I think your question puts the response to your question really suggests that we really need to have a clear sense of monitoring and science so that we can actually mark progress over time. And to your earlier point, we've got a few different pools of money here. We've got folks locally, we've got folks with NERDA, NIFWIF, and others. And so we all need to be talking to each other, I think, and it's a very high premium put on coordination and making sure our scientists are talking to each other. We've made some investments in the first FPL around monitoring, and the good news is that a lot of the people that are in NERDA are also in Restore, and there's a lot of good conversation going on, not only on the ground, but with other sources of funding as well. And so ultimately, the more we can do to coordinate both our vision and then how we measure impacts of the long term is going to be very important.
I'll jump in. I couldn't agree more with that statement. And I almost think we need to maybe generate some milestones of what success looks like. So success in the first year or two will look different than the ultimate success that we hope to achieve in 2 decades. But one of the big successes that we need to be working towards now is collaborating. And Robert's right, a lot of that collaboration is already happening, but it's somewhat behind the scenes, and the public actually isn't necessarily aware of it and informed of it. And it needs to be more robust. We've all been kind of, running around like our hair's on fire for the last couple of years, and now the case is settled. But it was just settled 2 months ago. We just, for the NRDA, are just finished up some standard operating procedures. Now it's time to kind of take stock of what's going on where, and set a milestone for what collaboration goals should we have in mind for year 1, year 2, so that the public can start to see, yes, we were successful in achieving what we said we would for that period of time, whether it's actually the projects on the ground or not. Hopefully that's a milestone that we can achieve, 3 or 4 years from now to be able to report out on those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think the coordination and communication is critical, and I think it's been fairly robust. I mean, we have certainly, as an early funder, tried to really integrate our federal partners into the conversation as well as the states, and I think that's bled over into Restore and NRD conversations. In terms of the monitoring, at the end of the day, if we're not using the same metrics and the same science, we will not be able to add all this up appropriately. So we're very cognizant of that as well, and have continued to work with with our federal partners and state partners to make sure we're measuring the right things, and at the end we understand what we've actually achieved. You know, to your point earlier, I think that this seems like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. There's no question about that. But in terms of the actual need, it's probably not sufficient to meet everybody's goal or desire or niche. But I think we collectively can make very well-informed, reasoned investments that are going to really elevate the bar significantly. To do that, we've got to be focused, as Roberta said. But there's a desire to, you know, sort of, we call it the chicken in every pot kind of methodology. And at the end of the day, if you do that, you miss the opportunity to really impact conservation on a landscape scale. And that's, I think, collectively what we want to try to avoid.
Well, so to that point, how do you approach prioritizing projects? So as you say, not nearly enough money to meet all of the needs, even though it's so much money. How do you think about which projects, you know, should rise to the top of it, especially when there are competing interests? You've got 5 states; they're all, you know, run by politicians who want something to show their own constituents. How do you figure out which ones should rise to the top, and how do you think about, you know, how to make this more than kind of a sum of its parts, that you're getting bigger bang for the buck?
So in Alabama, what we are doing is we are undertaking watershed management plans at local drainage scales, where it's a year-long to 15-month process of bringing the community together, educating them about watershed conditions and, you know, what the watersheds look like, what their problems are, and how we can fix them. And it's bigger than Restore dollars or NIFWIF dollars or NERDA dollars. Really, the BP oil spill dollars are a catalyst for us, if we do our job right, to change how we manage our coastal resources, improve and optimize how we manage our coastal resources. With these watershed plans, there are 31 of them that we're undertaking. We're also building a tool in partnership with the Nature Conservancy to help us compare and contrast conditions, characterizations, and identified projects, both within watersheds and between watersheds throughout Alabama's coast. And we're working through, you know, over 100 stakeholders, resource agencies, scientists, community groups, to help us define what those evaluation criteria are, so that we can get to a habitat restoration plan that actually has some thought behind it, that's looking at a suite of different criteria, as opposed to this political subdivision, you know, is advocating this project versus that political, you know, the soccer complex or the bridge. Which one do we pick? We're looking at it more systematically, hopefully to get to something that's larger than the sum of its parts. And I think I'd like to get back to that other question and what success looks like. And we have worked a long time to figure that out in Alabama as part of our conservation plan. And really for us on the Alabama coast, it is access to water and open spaces. It's healthy shorelines. It's healthy populations of fish and wildlife. It's a promotion of our heritage and culture, which that's huge, I think, throughout the Gulf of Mexico. It's environmental resiliency and community resiliency in the wake of climate change impacts and, you know, storm surges and sea level rise. And at the end of the day, it's water quality. You know, our resources depend on clean water. And so that's really what success would look like to us.
And I would just add to that, I think everything you just mentioned is connected to the economic health of a lot of these communities. And so I think that's an important driver for folks as well. And so, you know, I would add that to the list. Maybe harder to measure than even some of the difficult ecosystem things, but I think it's important as the governors think about this, as the agencies, everybody participates in this. I think that's an important measure as well.
Well, so Robert, how do you think about prioritization? I mean, the Restore Council is probably like the hardest spot to be dealing with this. You've got state players on there who are each looking to bring something home. How do you avoid, as you say, the kind of chicken in each pot approach?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you know, one of the things we try to do in the FPL is to group projects by watersheds and to look at this on a watershed basis and to think about how you have a large-scale impact by not doing random acts of conservation across the landscape. So I think that's really important. To me, it puts a very high priority on how we develop projects and ensuring that not just Restore, but as we talk to NERD, as we talk to NIFWIF, that we have a project development process, if you will, that encourages all of us to think about how the different resources are going to be deployed. I think part of it is, if I'm sitting in the public or I'm sitting for a stakeholder group, I don't want the three groups of funding to be three black boxes, right? Transparency is better, and I think if we can do this in a more transparent way, and the public and stakeholder groups can actually see that there's conversations going on across the different funding, that NERDA dollars may be better used in some places, Restore dollars maybe have some more flexibility, likewise NIFWIF funds. And I think that, as we think about that, that's both complicated, but I think it's necessary to achieve our goals. The challenge is we're all on different time frames, right? And so that makes the coordination that much more important. But I think as we think about what we do in the comp plan, I think this idea of project development, thinking of large-scale watershed-based approach and doing it in a transparent way that will build public support is going to be important.
So we've gotten a few questions about baseline information. You know, in the immediate aftermath of the spill, there was a lot of conversation about, you know, do we even know what was there in the first place? How much work has been put into creating that baseline today? And Leslie, how do you kind of approach restoration when you're not maybe totally sure what was there before the spill?
Right, and that's even, you know, more complicated in the face of climate change to be able to really pin down what baseline exactly means. So obviously there's been a vast amount of data collected in the aftermath of the spill. We had numerous data sets in place as well at the time of the incident that just weren't, they hadn't been collected in the context of planning for this kind of scale of restoration. So those data sets, I think we now have a better handle on them, and they're more readily available and useful to that purpose. It's also worth noting that the damage assessment restoration plan incorporates a very large commitment to monitoring and adaptive management, and much of that effort will be about monitoring at a project scale. So, you know, setting real goals and metrics for which we're collecting data, which then across projects, you'll be looking at the potential benefit to particular resources that are intended to benefit from those projects. And then you'll be able to roll that up at more of a program scale of what do we think we accomplish and how does that compare to, you know, where we started in terms of some of that baseline data. So all of that data, every piece of data you are collecting essentially becomes your new baseline that is useful to that end. So I think the commitment to the monitoring and adaptive management is going to be really a big part of that approach. And I know that, you know, Restore and NIFWIF also have a major commitment to data collection related to the implementation of their projects as well.
At the local scale, our watershed management planning process is going to provide the baselines per watershed. It's focused on freshwater wetlands, streams, rivers, riparian buffers, and then intertidal marshes and flats, which is basically headwaters to the shore, sort of the story of an intertidal watershed. But those plans, and these are $250,000 a pop plans. We're investing a lot of money. We're hiring engineering teams to go in there and do it. They are providing data and they are providing baselines from which we can measure our progress as we implement each one of them.
So the challenge for NIFWIF, and it gets to Robert's point a little bit about, you know, each of these funding sources has different requirements, different standards, different procedures. The plea agreements that NIFWIF is operating under require that we fund projects that remedy harm to resources affected by the spill. That sort of baseline monitoring is a little bit, it's tough to make that plea compliance argument for us. We can do it, and we have done it. We've funded a number of projects. I think Roberto's alluding to that as well. But they have to inform, in other words, some bigger project vision. So we can do the upfront study, the monitoring, to inform a baseline if it's leading to the implementation of a project to remedy harm. I think there's a little more flexibility in some of the other funding sources. So we've not really been able to get at that very much. But I do think, you know, now that Restore Science funds are going to be coming online, NAS funds are out there, there's some other funding sources that can get at that, but it's definitely needed overall across.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about money. So the first payments from the big settlement are slated to come next April, but it's paid out over dozens of years. How, and the restoration need is immediate, right? I mean, we're still, the ecosystem, a lot of the injuries brought by the spill have not been remedied yet. How do we think about how to approach this more quickly? I know there's been some talk about creative financing, being able to sort of leverage the money that we know is coming later by, through creative means today. Tell us a little bit about how that conversation is going and, what is possible today and what might require legislative tweaks. I know, Robert, you've thought about this a little bit.
Yeah, so, I think one big question is, from our standpoint, how often do we issue an FPL, right? How often do we fund projects? And the benefit of doing it more often is that you get money out quickly. The drawback is that you speed the project development process, which could have challenges with respect to coordination. But also, if you want to affect large-scale, watershed scale, you need to think about investing bigger chunks of dollars. And so part of the conversation I think we have in the comprehensive plan is exactly how often we think about issuing new FPLs. So that's, I think that's a kind of a critical piece. Now, your point about financing, that's also another conversation we're having. The Restore Council has a staff of about 20 people right now. It's a federal agency. Federal agencies can't spend money they don't have. There's a little thing called the Anti-Deficiency Act. Either me or my boss are going to jail if we run a skew of it. He's not very excited about that, so it's probably me. But joking aside, we can't spend money we don't have, right? But can we think about creative ways that we can actually finance? And so there are a lot of conversations going on. As many of you know, there's a lot of really interesting work being done in conservation finance right now. So there's starting to be a conversation between people in the conservation community about how we think about this. And there may be other opportunities for other organizations to participate here. And so I don't have an answer for you right now. I would say that the conversations are going on and there's a lot of interest. And I think, I don't know if it requires a statutory fix, but I think there's some real creative thought going on.
Yeah, what does that look like at the local level? Does the money seem to be coming at the right times, or what would you like to see?
Well, there are two issues. One is in Alabama, the Restore Act created an Alabama Restore Council, and that is a council of elected officials. So if you are to bond, let's say, a project assuming future payments, those you're basically spending money from elected officials in the future that may not be the same that are deciding on the bond issue in the present state. So that's definitely a challenge in terms of, okay, can we spend future money when we may not even be the people that are sitting on this council at that future date and time? So there's that challenge. For us, there's since the oil spill, it's been a new normal for any resource agency that was pre-existing. We've had, the Sea Grant program, you have Fish and Wildlife Service, you have NRCS, USDA, the NEARS. There's lots of different pre-existing programs that were cobbling together resources. Now all of a sudden we want landscape scale restoration. And we're doing that, I think, and with NIFWIF money in this Dolive watershed where we already had a plan in place. That takes time. Elected officials, local governments aren't used to that scale of restoration. Resource agencies aren't used to that scale of restoration. Permitting agencies aren't used to that scale of restoration. So that one case study, if you will, of the Dolive watershed, the plan was finished in 2010. We started that planning process in 2007 by creating baselines. We're just beginning to do some of the restoration. That's a 10-year restoration timeline right there, and we're just getting to changing regulations and educating the public and doing the restoration. So it's a challenge. When we apply for a grant from NIFWIF or through the Restore Bucket 2, we know the money is there, but then we have to go back to the local elected bodies and say, okay, we know we have this money from Restore Bucket 2. However, we know the project needs to be done now, but the state has to have its standard operating procedures in place. This is the first round of projects for the Restore Council, so they don't quite have their contracting procedures in place. So there's a lot of administrative issues that have to be dealt with before we can actually get that money on the ground. So whereas that local city may be wanting to do that project in September of this year, our money may not come through until next June, hypothetically speaking. Same thing with the NIFWIF project. You have to write the grant, you have to do a pre-proposal, then you have to do a full proposal, then it has to get approved by the board, then you have to go into contracting. So the timeline just to get that money on the ground doesn't quite fit with the necessity of the project. So it's really, there's a lot of variables at play that make our days go by very fast when we're trying to put all of this together.
Well, sort of keying off of that point, we've got a number of questions here about coordination. We've talked about that a little bit, but make it concrete for me. So you've got these, 3 main funding streams, but then you've got, there are other USDA programs, there are other EPA programs, there's lots of programs out there. How do you really coordinate, especially when you're kind of the end goal is this large scale restoration? How do you coordinate making sure that that you're tapping the right revenue stream is being tapped for the right type of project, that there's not duplication, and how do you do this in a transparent way so that the public has an opportunity to weigh in as well?
I can take a first shot at that. From one tool that we're going to be using in an NRDA, in the NRDA construct that I think has broader applicability is development of what we're calling strategic frameworks. And those are being specifically developed for marine mammals, sea turtles, birds, and oysters that could be broadened out to other resource types. The goal of that strategic framework is basically to take the restoration approaches that are identified in our restoration plan and to think through, because right now those restoration approaches are just kind of, yes, they're tools in a toolbox. We could choose to use these. Well, how would you sequence how you use those? Which ones need to come first? Which geographies would be most applicable for some of those tools versus other tools being more applicable in another geography? So we're going to be undertaking that effort in the NRDA. In my way of thinking, there's no reason that it should actually be broadened out because that's going to be the NRDA view of the world. But there's no reason to not do something more umbrella that says, okay, for sea turtles more broadly with all the resources that we have available, what should we be tackling in regard to what does success look like for sea turtles? Identify that. How do we get there? This strategic framework will identify the NRDA opportunities that we have, and because we already know exactly how much money we're going to spend on sea turtles, as indicated in the allocation table in the plan. So we could use that as kind of a stepping stone, I think, to move in that direction. Another opportunity is, as we've been saying on the monitoring piece, there are efforts currently underway. We're developing for the NRDA a tool that will house all of our monitoring data. Our goal is, and the collaboration efforts that have been underway to this point, have been to ensure that, to the extent possible, that all of the monitoring metrics will be aligned and to figure out what other tools could connect to that efficiently. But that all has to happen kind of on the front end in order for that that collaboration to actually be effective, because if we all start going out and implementing the projects, but we aren't aligned, then the coordination won't be as effective as we all would like it to be. But I think what you're hearing is we're all, I think I can probably speak for everyone up here, everyone in the room and in the Gulf of Mexico, everybody is in a position of wanting the most thoughtful, strategic approach to restoration implemented as quickly as possible, because there's a need. And so that's a rub that we're all trying to figure out, what is that sweet spot? How do we say, okay, we have enough information to take this action because it's important, and whether it's a low-hanging fruit, whether it's a no-brainer, whatever you want to call it, what actions can you queue up that we can all agree on while we continue to evolve in our way of thinking? And just one more point on that as well. The NRDA also has a big commitment, as I mentioned, to adaptive management. And so You know, there's no way that sitting here, again, maybe just using that one example of climate change, that we can say in 2016, oh, this is what it looks like. This is the next 10 years of implementing projects. That wouldn't be true to the entire plan, which is implement, you know, the plans in some kind of sequence that we can all agree that these are the most important things to do first, learn from that, then take your next action. But we all have to do that in some way that we're all talking to each other around the same page about what that next action and the choices might be.
I might add on the coordination front, I think as we think about it from the restore side, if you were going to criticize, I think the first FPL, there was a sense that each of the agencies, each of the states, to a significant degree, not in all cases, kind of went off, put together projects, and then came back, and we all looked at them. But you could also imagine in the next comp plan a process that puts a premium on coordination across different pools of money as well as different agencies and states. You mentioned the Farm Bill, so we have USDA will end up putting more Farm Bill dollars on the ground in this region than we will restore dollars that come to us. And so for us, a big thing is leverage. Well, you know, can you create a project development process that encourages that types of leverage, where we're talking to NERDA, we're talking to NIFWIF, and that projects that do that are ones that are rewarded. And so as you think about a comprehensive plan, it's not that you can engineer that. It's not that you can create very inflexible criteria to require that. But I do think you can create incentives for the states and the agencies and the partners on the ground to think about this in a more holistic way, and to think about how you piece together not only these three funding sources, but maybe it's Land and Water Conservation Fund, maybe it's Farm Bill programs at NRCS or other similar programs.
So it's been mentioned a couple of times that, you know, across these various funding streams, it's oftentimes the same players that are having those conversations. So while you might have, you know, NIFWIF here and Restore there, at the state level, at the agency level, it's the same people. How do you do that? So if these are happening in kind of conversations, how do you do that in a transparent way so that the public can weigh in, so that it's not just conversations that are happening behind closed doors and that, you know, okay, here we come, like we coordinated, we're telling you. How do you do it in a way that the public, you know, can see what happened? I don't know, Mike, if you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, so early on in our process, we realized that the states, through that consultation provision in the plea, were critical. We really wanted them, the state resource agencies, to take the lead in terms of nominating projects to us for consideration. Each of the states has a web portal where people can make suggestions. I think through a lot of the planning efforts that are going on, Roberta's and in other states, the public is very engaged. There's a lot of dialogue and a lot of conversation about what should happen, and there's not maybe the level of understanding in terms of which funding source should fund which type of project or those kinds of things. That's a little elevated, but I do think generally there's a lot of engagement, and I think the public is very, very much involved in those conversations. Ultimately for us, it's about the relationship that we have with the state, priorities that we've mutually agreed to try to advance, and getting those sort of through the state system to us for consideration.
Roberta, what does it look like on the ground? Like, does it, from where you sit, is it clear which funding source you should be tapping for things? Do you see that coordination happening?
So I can't overstate the value that the National Estuary Program and its management conference has had in Alabama, and frankly in Florida and Texas and Louisiana. But in Alabama, our management conference, which is basically the body that comes together to vet projects, vet issues, if you will. It's over 100 strong, and it's open to whoever wants to come to any meeting. And so we typically hold 6 meetings quarterly, whether it's science, government networks, business resources, community groups, or project implementation, or finance. So there's always a meeting that's open to the public to come and hear about what the issues are, what the projects are being discussed, what the different funding sources are. When we started watershed planning, it was pre-oil spill. We weren't doing this for oil spill dollars. We were frankly doing it to get EPA dollars and looking at soil and water conservation dollars. we were already looking at what is the landscape of potential funding sources, because we were cobbling together whatever money we could find to get projects on the ground. And we still do that. We're not just looking at NIFWIF or restore dollars. We're looking at, in the Doe watershed, we have EPA dollars, we have soil and water conservation dollars, we have local dollars, we have Go Mesa dollars or royalty dollars, and then we've got NIFWIF, big chunk of NIFWIF. But it's still a mosaic of funding sources. So I think the value of the estuary program in bringing all of these key stakeholders to the table is that each one of those stakeholders, whether it's the state of Alabama being able to talk about the different funding sources that it can bring to the table, or the Port Authority, or Fish and Wildlife Service, or Sea Grant, or any of the myriad of different federal interests, or state interests, or local interests, they're all at the table through the National Estuary Program Management Conference, and we know what that mosaic is, and then it's a matter of saying, okay, we know we have this project in this watershed, and it's in the headwaters. NIFWIF's not going to be interested in that because they're interested in things that are more marine related. So maybe we can go to Restore Bucket 2 because they're looking at things on a 30,000 foot, from a 30,000 foot level versus NIFWIF's 10,000 foot level. It's really important for us resource managers on the ground to coordinate the different funding sources, which means we need to understand what the priorities are of each one of those different funding sources so we can plug it in at the appropriate scale and for the appropriate project.
So we've got a couple of questions about the extent to which restoration in deep water is being considered. So Leslie, you started out by noting that this spill happened offshore in the deep water. Obviously, what we as humans on land, see and think about a lot is the terrestrial side of things, and wetlands get a lot of attention, certainly in Louisiana. To what extent are you in the restoration planning addressing these kind of offshore resources, and what do we even know about how to restore some of the deep water organisms?
Yeah, so we have a portion of the restoration plan is focused on open ocean resources. I think one of the ones you're specifically referring to would be mesophotic, deep benthic kinds of resources. And we have identified some potential restoration approaches to deal with those injuries. The kinds of things we're looking at, range from actual hands-on restoration in ways that we've never explored it in those particular habitats, to using some different protective measures, perhaps, as a way to ensure that those resources have the best chance of possible at maintaining, in the face of all the other stressors that they're facing. So certainly it's a major focus for NOAA in terms of how to balance what is a major focus on coastal restoration with some of the resource needs in the offshore. So some of our marine mammals that are in the offshore, what can we do for them? What kinds of data gaps might exist that could improve how we're managing those resources to improve their populations. Sea turtles as well kind of falls into that category. Now, some of the restoration for sea turtles could happen in the coastal environment, but there could potentially be actions in the open water as well. And then fishery resources are another big area that we have a large allocation towards restoration of fish, the restoration type for fish. And there could be things like working with the fisheries in different ways on bycatch reduction, whether it's commercial interests or recreational interests. So I encourage people, if they haven't kind of explored it, there's a suite, as I mentioned, this toolbox that has this restoration approaches identified, to spend some time with that, because I think there are some unique ideas. And now the question is just, as I mentioned before, how do we think about staging those? How do we strategically plan to execute some of the, what are the first priorities? How do we stage them? How do we sequence them through time?
How about NIFWIF and Restore? How do you, especially given the focus that both of those funding streams have on state engagement, I mean, offshore waters are beyond state lines in a lot of cases. How do you ensure that that gets attention?
I think that's right. And so, there's obviously going to be a heavy emphasis on where states can see benefits within state or just off the coast. But I think water quality and water quantity, I think, turn out to be really important things that have benefits well out off the coast. And so I think that's an area where I think we can have significant benefits, both onshore and offshore. And so I think, you know, the emphasis on habitat, estuaries, and water, both quality and quantity, I think are important. The other thing I'd say just broadly is that, you know, we've talked a lot about the need to coordinate and the challenges associated with that. The good news is there's actually there are a lot of projects and restoration type that we've got quite a bit of experience with that are, I would argue, relatively low risk. And that we know produce not only benefits to the Gulf, but there are enormous co-benefits associated with it as well, right? And so the good news is here is that actually the suite of projects or the potential projects is fairly broad that have substantial benefits, again, for the Gulf and for co-benefits. And I think maybe that's the silver lining of not having all the resources we need to get this done. I mean, one of the things that struck me about the projects that came into in our first FPL was there was actually a lot of really good stuff. Now, there's a question of how do you coordinate it? How do you make sure you put it together so that you're acting at scale, and so you're doing it in a way that's measurable. But you know, thanks to a lot of good work on the ground from folks for a long time, there's actually a suite of work out there that I think is relatively low risk that has high benefits.
Just to pick up on Robert's point and Leslie's as well, I think a lot of those species that use the open ocean are really charismatic and people really care about them. There's a lot of passionate interest about them, marine mammals, sea turtles, et cetera, fish. Our focus has been, because we have not really had an understanding of where NRD was going to go or how that was going to play out in the deep water. Our focus has really been on trying to ensure nesting success, breeding success, habitat protection, water quality improvements for turtles, marine mammals, fisheries stock assessments to kind of get a better scientific lens on what's happening in fisheries. And I think those projects have been very well received. I think the public really people generally really support them. But for us, I think that the deep water is really the deep water. We look out there and we're not sure where to go there. I'm not sure the states are comfortable yet submitting projects. I think most of that will probably come through NRD in terms of corals and those types of projects. But there's a lot we can do, and as you know, as Robert said, there's a lot of good work that's already been done, and really what we've been able to do is just expand capacity and build on that good work that Roberta and others have done, and others in marine mammal, sea turtle, and fisheries communities have already done great work, and we're just sort of elevating it and moving it forward. And I think doing that across the landscape of the Gulf will have, you know, big benefits for those resources later.
Well, how could anybody forget that it is election season? We've got, you know, transitions coming. What? So we've got transitions coming not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level as well. I'm wondering how all of you are thinking about how you carry over the work that's happening now. And Roberta, I think maybe starting with you, given that there's, you know, so many levels that you're dealing with there.
Yes, there are. I think for us, it's that coordination. It's bringing the different stakeholders to the table to make sure that they understand what the issues are and they understand what the actions are that are being taken to address those issues, so that it's not just the environmentalists that are trying to educate these newly elected officials. It's the chambers of commerce. It's the citizens and the port authorities and, you know, the business interests, frankly, because they are big drivers that are saying the environment is important, we need to protect it. You need to, you know, look to protecting wetlands, and you need to ensure water quality. As long as we have the community at large advocating, I think whoever's in office is irrelevant, because we're collectively advocating for a cleaner water supply and a healthier environment. And that's really what we work toward doing. And as far as the estuary program is concerned, and I think Robert can attest to this, through the first FPL, because of the success of the estuary programs in the Gulf, they're looking to build other ones in Florida and in Mississippi. And it's not because the Restore Council thinks it's important, it's because Mississippi and the Florida Panhandle are saying, we need help in establishing this same level of coordination that is going on in other places and is demonstrating success. So I can't underscore the value of bringing, different political interests, different economic interests, different environmental interests to the table to vet what the issues really are and what we're all trying to work towards. And it makes a stronger product and it's a stronger message in the end.
How about at the top level, Robert?
Well, I actually think, Roberta, your point is right on, which is if you build support among stakeholders in the public, it matters less who comes next, and politicians listen to the public. And so I think that's a critically important point. At the same time, we have to think at the federal level about making sure that we can pass along the lessons, as it were, to the folks that come after that. We've got incredibly talented career staff in all of the agencies that are working on this, and that's an important piece of it. Just as the states have really good people. And I would say, on the Restore Council, we operate, obviously you have a Democratic administration, you have a Democratic governor and 4 Republican governors. We have to operate in a bipartisan way. And I think that's part of the conversations. One of the things I've been struck about from the whole time with the Restore Council is the level of mind share amongst the states and the feds around a number of things. So I'm actually quite optimistic. I think building the stakeholder support and having us do our level best to have the federal agencies in as good a place as they can to pass along the lessons learned is the best we can do, and I'm quite optimistic that whoever comes after will take that into account.
I'll also add, I completely agree with all that. The more you have, the relationships built and agreement on what we're trying to achieve, at a microcosm as well as scaling up, that's going to make all the difference. And then I think it is important to codify some of those things in some way. And so I think at least for the NRDA, having the restoration plan that identifies specific approaches. Not everything in the world is listed there. Not that we couldn't change that plan if in 10 years a whole new, better approach to do something comes to light. Certainly there is the opportunity to do that, but that would be a very large effort. By developing these strategic frameworks that I spoke of, again, there's nothing in them that's going to be written in such hard stone that you could never modify from it, but having a bit of a roadmap that we say, okay, we started at this big scale with our restoration plan, we're funneling it down a little bit, here's a little bit of a stepwise approach that we're all agreeing at this point in time seems to put us on the right trajectory. In the NRDA, we just finished standard operating procedures, which starts to lay out, because while we do have career professionals, this money's going to come in over multiple decades. Well, 15 years, we're going to be spending it for 2 decades. Many of those people would be moving on, and just a natural change in, why do we do things that way? Well, because we wrote it down, and we can change it, but having something to reference, I think, is really valuable as well.
I agree with everything that was said there. The only other thing I would add is that many the underpinnings of all of these efforts is good science, and if good science is continuing to drive decision making, it's very hard to sort of trump that politically. And we have the Louisiana example, as Robert alluded to. We've had a change in administration there. That Louisiana Coastal Master Plan is built on really sound science, and science is informing at every stage as it's moving forward. That transition has gone very smoothly, and I think that hopefully will carry forward with the other states as well as they transition, as we transition to a new administration here in Washington as well.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time here. This is, I personally think, incredibly fascinating and important to be watching, not just for the sake of the Gulf, which is a massive ecosystem in its own right, but I can tell you on Capitol Hill, I've heard lawmakers considering whether some of the things that are being tried for the first time in the Gulf might be good models going forward. I know these folks all say it's a little too early to tell if things are successful yet or not, but I think that what's happening in the Gulf is going to be something to watch for really decades to come. So thank you.
I want to personally thank Annie and the panel members for such a great session. I think the audience can come away with an appreciation on how complex the issue and task is at hand, and the recognition on the number of stakeholders that really have to be at the table being part of the process. So thank you very much. Before we break for lunch, I want to make a special announcement that during lunch, we're going to have a special film screening of Sonic Sea, which is sponsored by the International Fund for Animal Welfare and the National Resource Defense Council. Please join IFAW and NRDC in the main session room, i.e. here, with your lunch for a special CHOW cut of the documentary Sonic Sea, which was recently debuted on the Discovery Channel. Sonic Sea is about understanding and protecting the vast symphony of life in our waters and the actions we can take to reduce the impacts of ocean noise. So we have lunches, as in the past days, available in the other room for premier registrants, and today's ticket color is blue. And we also have additional extra lunches that are available for purchase. And if you are interested in purchasing a lunch, you can do so at the registration table. We encourage you, in addition to coming back for the film, to visit the exhibits. And our next session, which will be Local Voices and Traditional Knowledge of a Sustainable Arctic Economy, will begin promptly at 1:15. So enjoy your lunch and thank you.